Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Jason Morrison. I serve as the head of the Seal Water Mandate, which is a 13-year-old partnership between the UN Global Compact and the Pacific Institute. And we're going to talk today about the launch of an initiative called the Water Resilience Coalition. Thank you for taking the time to join with us today. In terms of the format of the session, I'm going to start off by presenting some slides to lay the context for this discussion. And then I'm going to hand to my colleague, Jennifer Schorsch, the president of water.org, who is a member of the Water Resilience Coalition's governing body called the Leadership Committee. And she's going to shepherd a discussion with two of our co-founding members of the Water Resilience Coalition. And I will do a more thorough introduction of Jennifer when the time comes. But let me first start by trying to set the stage with some comments here about the Water Resilience Coalition. I want to start with a great quote from one of the WRC's founding companies, the Anheuser-Busch Company, and Carlos Brito. And it's just a quote that shows that despite companies that have led on water for well over a decade, there's this increasing recognition that it is impossible, no matter how large the size of the company, for any one company to try to adjust the water challenge alone, and that we need to look for new structures that allow companies to partner with one another and other organizations in order to have impact at scale. And that's in the essence of what the Water Resilience Coalition is about. So the WRC launched on World Water Day, the theme of World Water Day this year being water and climate. And at the essence of this initiative is the recognition that there's a need to both elevate the ambition on water and to accelerate the action. And this is an initiative that's oriented around companies that start by making an enterprise level, time-bound, quantifiable commitment on water, and it's the same commitment. So there's an alignment of ambition and intention, and also a commitment that the company's senior leadership be directly involved in raising the awareness around the platform. Because it's about accelerating change, integral to the way that the coalition is carrying out its work is to look to innovate solutions. And we'll talk a little bit today about whether that's around new ways of using data and information, or new ways of being able to evaluate where and how to prioritize on the right water challenges in the right location. There's innovations around the way that we'll co-finance strategies at the basin scale and other things that will be advancing through the coalition's work. And lastly, the coalition is about acting together in water stress basins so that there's scale at impact in those same basins and the ability to move towards more water resilient systems. But let me pan out a little bit first. When people talk about the water crisis, what are they referring to? So at times it's about having too little water. At other times it's about too much water. And globally, we have a scenario where water quality is deteriorating to the point where it's unfit for purpose in many parts of the world. We also have a situation where there's an imbalance in terms of the social equity and the distribution of water, with a very large percentage of the world's population that lack basic access to clean water and sanitation services. And the challenges with that become quite pronounced when you have a global pandemic, such as COVID-19, where the first line of defense is hand washing, and literally billions of people that do not have hand washing facilities in their own homes. There's also the instance of dewatering our freshwater aquatic systems, and this is a moral imperative to making sure that we maintain biodiversity of those freshwater ecosystems. But importantly, the function of these ecosystems is deteriorating to the point where they're unable to filter and manage storm events the way they historically have. And then lastly, the issue of either failing or in some places inadequate infrastructure to meet the needs going forward of our population. So between 2015 and 2030, we're going to add 1 billion people to the planet. And that increase in population leads to knock-on increase for the needs for water for energy, for food, just more water for cities and residences. World Resources Institute recently updated long-term demand forecasting, supply and demand forecasting, and have showed that by 2030, if trends continue as they currently are, that 56% overshoot in global supply versus, in global demand versus supply. And yet we're already facing severe water stress. So-called day zero is making the news in multiple cities around the world. But these challenges are getting more pronounced and more frequent. You can barely pick up the newspaper without reading about a storm event or a prolonged dry period somewhere around the world. And then there's climate change and the uncertainty that that creates for water systems and the ability to provide water reliably. 9 in 10 natural disasters are water related. Already we feel the economic damage of that. By 2050, it's predicted that we'll have $1 trillion in flood-related damages a year. And because of the increased variability and unpredictability of water, it's estimated that by the year 2050, that more than 5 billion people will not have sufficient water at least 1 month out of the year. And the business community is aware of these risks, almost 90% that understand that they face water-related risks, but less than half actually have strategies in place to be able to manage these risks and to address the water challenge more generally. And CDP recently, last year, produced a report where they looked at the companies that were reporting to their water questionnaire from the years 2015 to 2018, and they found that roughly 50% of the companies reporting to them were increasing their water use on an annual basis. And this isn't because they're becoming more wasteful, it's simply because the companies are growing and therefore their absolute water use is increasing. But for the reasons that I've presented, the global resource does not allow for companies to just continue to grow and continue to use more water in absolute terms. So something needs to be done. This year, with the organizations that are logoed on the cover, the CO Water Mandate did a review of companies and what those companies are doing at the nexus of water and climate. And we found that most companies are still not thinking about water and climate beyond their direct operations. And while there is anecdotally a lot of leadership emerging, we are not, as a business community, moving with the sense of urgency or at the scale that's needed to address the water climate nexus. And in large part, we think that's because there's a lack of structured approaches to take this action. But the action needed is going to require a range of activities across operations and improving efficiency and pollution control, to investments in catchments and the ability to adaptively govern water and to build local government capacity to do so effectively. So what does it mean for companies to build resilience in a way that will simultaneously allow for resilient communities? And there are 4 domains I'd like to talk about quickly. One is just about operational excellence, whether that be water use efficiency or pollution reduction. There's lots of gains that have happened in recent years, but there's lots of work that can be done as well. And whether this is the company's transition to circularity and thinking, and companies like Tata Steel that are now reusing 90% of their water on site, or Nestle that's moved to zero water facilities in a number of locations around the world. There's still lots to be done on improving water use in operations. But it will also require investments in watersheds to try to improve water security in those watersheds. And many of those investments we know have potential to have GHG or greenhouse gas benefits in addition to building water resilience in those basins. We must tackle the social inequity around water and improve access for vulnerable populations. and the business community will need more to advocate in the public policy space and to innovate and invest in those innovations. So who is in the Water Resilience Coalition? There's a leadership committee with companies named here and a number of advisors that serve on this governing body, Jennifer, as mentioned, being one of those advisors. And there are also a number of members representing a range of industries that are also part of the coalition, 16 companies strong. The partners that we work with range from those that are implementing partners to technical partners to advocacy partners. And we look forward to the opportunity to collaborate with many more organizations as the coalition gets its footing. One of my last slides is to talk about the pledge itself, the commitment that companies take when they join the Water Resilience Coalition. And I want to talk about the three columns here that you see. First is this concept of net positive water impact. And this is the idea that companies will have more positive contribution than negative impact in the water stress regions where they have operations. And when we think about having a net positive water impact, we look at the three dimensions of water stress: availability, quality, and accessibility. And the set of actions that are a combination of the efforts that companies take at their operations and what they do at the basin scale. The second is the notion of water resilient value chains and working to develop and implement and enable strategies for supply chain partners and customers to be able to improve their own water resilience. And lastly, this vocal leadership about reaching out to other companies and to other stakeholders to accelerate the action on water. So we hope that many of the people viewing today will consider seriously joining the Water Resilience Coalition. I'd like to make a couple of cases on why. One is this coalition has already emerged as a spearhead for accelerating action on water and for the business community to drive a new level of ambition. It is overseen by direct engagement of CEOs that share a common purpose around water. There are a number of stakeholders that are supporting the effort and bring complementary skills from companies that are really important to the effectiveness of the consortium. There is a lot of peer learning taking place. We'll hear today of leading examples that companies are taking in their own companies and operations, but that's a learning process that's shared across the consortium. And lastly, the opportunity for having scalable impact in the communities where your business operates. And the last point I'll make here is around the SDG ambition, which some of you may have seen was announced during this last UN General Assembly. There are a number of goals that are a focus that we're not on track to achieve by 2030, one being the goal on water. And for the SDG ambition, the notion of net positive water impact is the cornerstone of what companies can do to elevate their own actions around water to help us achieve SDG 6. So we see this concept as the cornerstone not only of the coalition, but the way that the business community can mobilize to contribute toward achievement of SDG 6. So here is the website where you can find a little bit more information about the Water Resilience Coalition, but let's open it up now and have a discussion about what some companies are doing to lead their efforts on water. I'm going to hand to Jennifer Schorsch, who's been the president of water.org now since 2011, I believe. Before that, she was at Starbucks for a number of years, turning it from a 150 store chain into a global brand. And before that, I believe with Bain & Company. You have a business degree at Harvard Business School, undergraduate at Dartmouth. And since being at water.org, spent quite a bit of time helping to grow the organization, helping improve WASH services for over 30 million people and bringing finances over 2 billion, 2.4 billion in financing for WASH solutions. So with that, Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate the introduction, and I want to thank everyone again who's joined us. We're 400 and counting. As Jason said, I serve as president of water.org, and at water.org, we are singularly focused on enabling access to the 2 billion people who live without water and sanitation. We do this through affordable finance, and we also work to create sustainable system change so that we can connect diverse stakeholders in water, finance, and sanitation to try to accelerate progress against this urgent issue as Jason has laid it out. We're very fortunate as an organization to work with many corporations and corporate foundations. And I'm delighted to have two experts with me today that we partner with as well. So first, let me just recap the goals of today. We're going to inform about how the water crisis is a significant business risk. We're going to share how two experts and their leading companies are not only setting bold ambitions, but also taking aggressive action. Reveal what you can do as a company. For those of you in any size organization, you play a role here in moving us forward against this issue. And finally, as Jason has already so warmly done, invite you to join the Water Resilience Coalition. And he gave you 5 good reasons to do so. I'm going to turn my attention now to 2 more good reasons to do so, and that's Jill Koling and Dr. Lucas Joppa. And so with that, let me give you a little bit of background about these 2 experts. We are fortunate to have these leading experts with us this morning or this evening. And they represent corporations who have publicly set bold ambitions around addressing this issue and significantly have taken action in that direction. So a little bit about Jill. As Vice President for Global Sustainability, Jill contributes 25 years of experience in sustainability and technology to accelerate Cargill's efforts to solve climate change, protect the world's water and land resources, and limit food waste. She and her team leverage their expertise and global partnerships to sustainably nourish people and the planet while helping farmers prosper. She's described as, and I love this, Jill, a sustainability trailblazer and has degrees in both mechanical engineering and computer science. Our next expert, Dr. Lucas Joppa from Microsoft. Lucas leads the sustainability efforts at Microsoft as the company's first chief environmental officer. When Fortune magazine named him to their 40 under 40 list this year, they characterized his role as one with planetary scale responsibilities. Lucas works to advance Microsoft's core commitment to sustainability through ongoing technology innovation, program development, policy advancement, and global operational excellence. Prior to his current role, Lucas spent 8 years in Microsoft's Blue Sky Research Division, establishing a program called Artificial Intelligence for Earth, AI for Earth, a 5-year, $50 million cross-company effort dedicated to delivering technology-enabled solutions to the global environmental challenges. Lucas also brings a storied background, a combined background in both environmental science and data science, with degrees in wildlife ecology and a PhD in ecology. So with that lead up, we, as you can see, have 2 world experts with us, and I'd like to turn the floor over to them. Jill, could I invite you first to just introduce your role, introduce how Cargill is looking at building water resilience, and a little bit about the journey at Cargill?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. So, as Jennifer said, I work for Cargill and lead our sustainability work here. And for those who don't know Cargill, so we're a very large agriculture and food company based in the United States, operating in about 70 countries around the world. And so we source and process all sorts of agricultural commodities. So things like soybeans, maize, wheat, chickens, beef, cocoa, palm fruit, and the list goes on and on. So have a really complex supply chain that's truly global. And agriculture feeds all of us, but it also contributes to a lot of the water challenges we have. So approximately 70% of the world's fresh water is being used for agriculture. So clearly water is hypercritical for our business and for our resilience in our future. And we've at Cargill experienced firsthand how critical water can be. So about 7 years ago, we had to close a beef processing plant here in the US in Texas And Texas is very much cattle country, for those who aren't familiar. And we had a very large beef plant, and that region was experiencing serious drought. And what happened was ranchers, it became difficult to feed and provide water to their cattle. And so they began selling it and they didn't acquire more. And basically the supply of cattle started to dwindle in the region. And we had to shut down a very large plant and have never reopened it, right? So we've experienced firsthand what water risk can do to our business. And so we, for many years, have had water efficiency targets, but they frankly weren't super inspired, and they were focused solely on our own operations. So goals around increasing the efficiency of water use within our own plants. And so it's super important for us to work in our own operations, right? We need to do our part. But in agriculture and food, the vast majority of the water footprint is in our value chain, right? And so we realized if we're really going to tackle this, we've got to get outside of our own four walls. And we also have to look at not just water availability, but also water quality and accessibility, and need to include those in our scope of targets. And so this past summer, we announced new ambitious context-based water targets that cover all three of those areas. And really our ambition is to achieve sustainable water management both within our operations as well as in all of our priority watersheds for sourcing by 2030. And what we've done over the past about 18 months is really gone through this process to prioritize where action is needed most. So our historical targets just covered all of our plants everywhere, right? And we've really found makes much more sense to do the analysis, right? And identify where are the priority watersheds where we operate. And we did this based on baseline water stress, which is a widely accepted means for identifying exposure to water risks. And then we also looked at priority watersheds for our sourcing regions around the world. And those were identified based on a risk assessment for things like exposure to water depletion, excess nitrogen, runoff, or where improved access to safe drinking water is needed. So like I said, our new targets are context-based, they're watershed-specific, and they're proportional to the severity of the water-related challenges facing the specific watershed and looking at Cargill's contribution to those challenges. And many of the solutions we employ to achieve our water ambition and our strategy directly align with our other key focus areas for sustainability, like climate change, like farmer livelihoods, and human rights. And we know that things like investing in soil health best practices in our agricultural supply chain have many interrelated benefits, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving water quality, increasing drought resilience, and enhancing farmer prosperity. So we've really seen this great link with water and the other areas where we're working. Other examples that provide those synergies would be restoring natural grasslands, sustainable cattle grazing, and those community programs, right, that improve access to safe water. So we know we can't achieve these water goals alone, right? As Jason said in his intro, these are big challenges and these are shared challenges, right? And we know with water challenges being location specific and multidimensional, these are often shared with other stakeholders in the same watershed. And so by joining the Water Resilience Coalition, this really provides a vehicle for us to collaborate, to align on thought leadership, and really work with others who have great thinking in this area to find solutions that will scale.
Thanks so much, Jill. It's interesting to think about the journey and the perspective shift that you all have gone on at Cargill, thinking really specifically about your operations and then expanding out to looking at context-based solutions, the need to collaborate, to look at water's role within the broader environmental remit that you have. So appreciate that context. Thank you. It's interesting too to think about collaboration because here we've got a very different business that Lucas is representing. And so Lucas, I want to invite you to come into the conversation and share similarly a little bit of an introduction about how you at Microsoft are looking at these challenges, approaching them, a little bit about your journey. I think it'd be great to have bookends from two very different and diverse organizations who have an equally strong ambition in moving us forward on these targets.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think you're right. We are completely different businesses, Microsoft and Cargill. And I think, Jill's statistic shows agriculture using 70% of fresh water doesn't leave a lot for Microsoft to use after that. But no, I'm joking. But the important thing for us as a company really is to think about across the 4 dimensions of sustainability that we care about: carbon, water, waste, and ecosystems. 4 dimensions that are incredibly tightly interlinked. To think about concrete goals. Jill spoke about kind of the quantitative goals that they've been setting over at Cargill, and that's so important. And that's what Microsoft's been doing over the past year as well, thinking about what are the goals that we need to set in carbon, in waste, in ecosystems and biodiversity conservation, and in water. And you talked a little bit about kind of perspective and perspective shift over time. And one of the things that really changed my perspective on the topic of water. I'm somebody who thinks about climate a lot, and the broad scale impacts of climate. And there's a colleague that I work with in Microsoft named Paul Fleming, a water expert, and I'm gonna try to quote him. I'm sure I'll do it not entirely correctly, but he said something to me like, if climate is the book, water is the first chapter. And that really stuck with me about the importance of making quantified, robust water goals for Microsoft, even though we aren't one of the world's significant water users. We're not an agriculture company. We're not a bottling company, right? A lot of people wouldn't think of Microsoft as a significant consumer of water, and that's true at a global scale. But we've already heard, I think, from everybody that water is local. And so that's what became so important to me is, well, if water is local, that means that no matter how small you might be at a global scale, it's not the global scale that matters, it's the local scale. And you have to go down to that granular level of resolution and understand what your impact is everywhere that you operate. And so for us, obviously being able to figure that out requires a lot of collaboration and a lot of coordination. This isn't a topic that you can just easily go out and assess your impact in every geography in every part of the world and then take action, right? You need a coordinated body to work within. And that's why from the very beginning, Microsoft was so excited to get involved with the Water Resilience Coalition, because we know, I think Jill said it so well, we can't do this alone. None of us can. And so the WRC, or the Water Resilience Coalition, played a really important role in motivating us to set the water positive commitment that we just announced last month. And not just motivating us to do so, but helping us to understand the structure of how we should set that goal around accessibility, availability, and quality. And so, I was very proud we went through a kind of a 4 quarters of sustainability sprints at Microsoft. And so water was our last sprint. And I was quite pleased, A, just to get done with all of those sprints, but B, kind of where we ended up. We ended up as a company that in a year set commitments so that by 2030 we'll be a carbon negative, water positive, zero waste company, building a computational infrastructure of what we call a planetary computing platform to be able to really change the way that we monitor and ultimately manage natural resources. And I think we'll probably talk a lot about the need to transform our ability to monitor and manage water resources, because that really sits, I think, at the foundation of where a lot of our problems come from. And so I'll turn it back to you, I guess, Jennifer, and we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Lucas. Thinking about Paul's comment about water is the first chapter, you know, it's also said, and it's true, that climate shows up first as water, whether it's too much water, not enough water. And when you put into the perspective the uses for water, Jill very kindly introduced that agriculture uses about 70%, industrials about 20%, about 10% is left for municipal, which includes less than 5% for household level. So it is a shared responsibility to manage the global system because we all, the increasing population growth and the 2 billion people who are living without need to have a fair share of that water. And without companies stepping up, we can't ensure that the planet is healthy and that people have the fundamental needs that they need to survive. So it's wonderful. It's also interesting, Lucas, to think about your comment about water being local. And indeed it is. And one of the things that both of your companies have done and the coalition is doing is to look at basin management, but also to manage at a global level, whether it's policy advocacy or CEO-led, you know, driving awareness of the issues. So we have to work at this duality of global and local. I want to dive a little bit more into water security and water resilient systems. And Jill, you gave a great example of a business risk, you know, having to close down a plant. I'm wondering if maybe, Lucas, I could start with you to take that fourth sprint a little bit further and tell us more about what do you see will be required to build truly resilient systems over time to withstand the next inevitable shocks?
Well, I think that first and foremost, you already mentioned it. I mean, to have a truly resilient system, we need enough water, and we need enough water available in the quality that it's required for society to operate in every geography on Earth. You know, the water sprint, what we ended up committing to was to replenish more water than we use globally, but to do that replenishment specifically in the water-stressed regions in which we operate. You mentioned too much water, you know, in certain places and at certain times, too little water in certain places and in certain times. And so we're trying to make sure that our global operations, we replenish more than we use, but than we consume, but that we really, our impact is driven where it's most necessary. And I think that those sorts of local nuances to corporate action are what's going to be required to really drive that resiliency, to understand where the stress points are in the system and to focus in on those stress points in particular. I think one thing that is problematic is our understanding or lack thereof of our water resources, right? The sad kind of fact of the matter is that we are in the situation that we are with our freshwater resources because we are withdrawing from a system that we really do not fully understand. The volume of water available to us, where it is, where it's going, and whether or not it gets put back. And so I think that there is a lot of opportunity ahead of us to really change the way that we monitor these systems so that we can ensure that the resiliency that we're seeking is actually being implemented. But yeah, I think the resiliency of making sure that the water is there is important, but there's also resiliency of the system of actors in these regions, that there's actually alignment amongst the organizations that are responsible for the consumption in any particular region, alignment about what the problem is, an alignment on what the solution is, an alignment on, hopefully, investments and engagements to put those solutions into practice. And again, I would just go back to the WRC and the important role that the WRC can play in driving that alignment among actors.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place for us to pick up, and Jill, invite you into the conversation, because I read that I know you have direct operations in 70 countries, but I believe that you have partners and customers in 170 countries around the world. And so when Lucas talks about understanding the stressors and working as part of this broader system, I wonder if you could share with that backdrop your perspective on how do you mobilize and orchestrate and take a leadership role at Cargill to build resilience? What's your perspective on what's required for building resiliency?
Yeah, well, I would say, Lucas is lucky enough to have Paul, his water expert. We're lucky enough to have Truca Smore, a woman on my team who is a water scientist and an expert, because some of this is quite technical, right? Trying to really understand. And for us, as you mentioned, our scale is massive. And since it's a local, we know this is a local challenge. We have a lot of locations, right, where we've had to assess and analyze. And I think what's really important is understanding, first of all, which locations have the issues, but then what's the severity of the challenge faced by that particular community or watershed. And then also understanding as an organization, what is our contribution to those challenges, our own and our supply chain, our value chain? How are we contributing to that? So that's been really important for us to understand. And then when we look at engaging actors in our value chain, right, a lot of that, as I mentioned, is farmers and ranchers. And we're really looking at it from the perspective of we need resilient supply chains, right? And that means we need to help farmers and ranchers have more resilient farms, because that's what we need. And this link to climate is so real in agriculture, right? So as others have mentioned, we're seeing these major water events due to climate change. So really heavy rain events, right, which can lead to soil erosion, nutrient runoff, threatening water quality in these agriculture communities. Flooding events, right, which threatens farmers' abilities to harvest. I mean, we've had flooding events where we can't access our plants, a particular plant, for a period of time to process crops, right? And then I think during this pandemic, I mean, wow, has there ever been a time where we think more about the need for access to water for hygiene and sanitation, right? Especially in, for us, some rural farming communities around the world. So we're really focusing on how can we help our supply chain build more resilient operations of their own, which improves their livelihood and plans for their future. Farmers are people who care a lot about legacy, and all around the world, it's often passed down generation to generation, and they want resilient operations, right? And we need them to be resilient for us to exist for another 155 years at Cargill. So that's really how we're looking at things.
Yeah, I love how you brought the farmers into the perspective, because companies can work from the top down, but we need to provide the tools to help people work from the bottom up. And that's very much a part of what we hold dear at water.org, which is putting tools in the hands of the people who are living without water and sanitation to help them solve their own issue. And I know that you have had at Cargill a deep commitment to farmers and to communities and to accessible water. When we think about those three pillars that Jason talked about in the beginning, availability, quality, and accessibility, I want to go a little bit deeper on the accessibility question. So Jill, let me turn it back to you. And then Lucas, I'm going to ask you the same question. As you think about those three pillars, how do you think about accessibility? And we've talked to some companies who say that's not our business risk. It's really supply and quality. Of course, I would argue that the humanity of water access is absolutely critical, and you make such a good argument about the farmers. So could you talk a little bit more about how you think about accessibility?
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because we are in a process of kind of elevating our focus on human rights and really building out a coordinated corporate strategy in this space. And wow, you can link water. I mean, access to safe water and hygiene is a human right, right? And so it's really linked to a lot of our other work. And we look at it at Cargill as, you know, we don't just source from around the world, we operate around the world. And we have employees, our own employees in communities that are sometimes quite rural in developing countries, right? On palm plantations that are in incredibly rural places in Indonesia. And so, you know, access to safe water is important to our business because we're part of these communities, right? And so we need that for our business, for our employees, for license to operate, right? We also use water. When we build a new plant in a community, we're going to become a user of water. And depending on the plant, it may be a little or more, but we're going to become one of those community members that are now stressing potentially a local resource. And so we see that sort of accessibility as being every bit as critical to our business as the other two dimensions.
Yeah, I appreciate how you're thinking about the social aspect of it and looking out for the communities and recognizing that doing good by the communities is good business strategy. Lucas, I'd love to hear Microsoft's perspective on accessibility as part of the 3 pillars and how you're prioritizing that.
Yeah, I think accessibility is such an important part of the water story. It's one that until we set our water goals that last month was absent from our water story. And I think that that was a huge miss. And the reason that it's a huge miss is really, you know, of course, there's the human rights and humanitarian aspect of it. But I don't think you can really separate that out from your previous question about resiliency, right? Because if people don't have access to water, water is life. If people don't have access to water, life stops. You know, economies stop. Disruption and unrest occur. And none of those are good things. They're not good from a human rights perspective, a humanitarian perspective. They're not good from a corporate perspective and a business perspective. Ultimately, because water is local and communities are the social structure at a local level, it's communities that give corporations a license to operate. And if you don't respect the license that's been granted to you, that social license that's been granted to you, it can be revoked. And what could be more fundamental, right, than ensuring that the community that's granting you a license to operate has access to life itself, to water, right? For me, that was just a really big revelation as we thought about these goals. But it is true, it's easy to look at in a way of saying, well, what does accessibility have to do with my business operations, right? I take water out, maybe then my goal should be to put that water back, but what do the people and their ability to access it have to do? Well, we look at it as a company in that very kind of tightly integrated way of saying that those people that operate in the same water system that we operate in are incredibly important, are our stakeholders, right? And we have to work with them. I think because, you know, it was so important to us, and our access to the WRC and then the alignment that the WRC drives with the nonprofit space in the water world, particularly water.org, it was pretty easy for us then to work with you all, and the collaboration's been fantastic, Jennifer, to be able to establish this goal of providing accessibility to 1.5 million people in the 7 countries that have the most acute water accessibility problems. You know, India, Indonesia, some of these countries that we're starting our work together on. It's just going to be, hugely important to get that work done. But we as Microsoft, because we're relatively new in this game, we're going to learn so much from you guys. We're going to learn so much from the projects that we're working together on. And then hopefully the WRC can learn a lot from what we're doing, and that virtuous cycle goes on. I think that's what's so important about all this.
Yeah, there's a lot I'd love to tease out of that. First of all, we're honored to be that anchor partner for you on the accessibility side, and we're excited to deliver household level access to 1.5 million people in partnership with you. So that's one thing, just a thank you and acknowledgement that that's a good example of collaboration, of how you're making access a priority, and you're working, whether it's with water.org or others, to complement your knowledge and to drive action. I also want to tease out the concept you mentioned about the reputational license to operate. Again, as a way of saying access is fundamental to business strategy, because it is about the serving the communities in which you operate. And Jill, you make an excellent point around the farmers and having that be, your Cargill family and the ones that need to have access and need to have a sustainable supply of water. So I appreciate how both of your companies are doing this, first of all, making a commitment in water and climate more broadly, but elevating access in terms of recognizing it's not only the right thing to do, but it is significantly important for your business as well, for long-term sustainability in the community and the communities in which you operate. I want to turn our attention to something very timely. We had a brief conversation yesterday around the current pandemic. And as Jason said in the beginning, 3 billion people right now cannot wash their hands at home in the midst of a global pandemic because they lack that fundamental need. These two companies are helping, the WRC is helping to change that reality. And yet COVID has made us all do things differently and think differently. Jill, I'd like to turn to you to just offer your perspective on how this pandemic has shifted your priorities around sustainability or helped you think differently about it.
I would say the pandemic, being in the food industry, right? And so, with all this sort of panicked buying and stocking up of food, and the food supply chain was really stressed, especially earlier months of the pandemic around the world. And we've learned a lot about the importance of resilient supply chains, right? For various reasons. And we've had people question, like, are people going to still care about sustainability and some of maybe the environmental things, right, with the pandemic? And we've certainly seen that commitment hasn't wavered. I mean, COVID has been a bit of a disruption, right? Where we've had to have all hands on deck, right? Just trying to keep the food supply moving. So there's a disruption, I think, of focus for a period of time, but we haven't seen the dedication and importance of sustainability waver. In fact, maybe seen people doubling down where they've realized it's even more important. And we've looked at things different ways. So for example, in Côte d'Ivoire, we work with smallholder cocoa farmers, right, where we have a technology application we use with them to help mark GPS coordinates of their farms, right, part of our forest protection work. But we realized we could use this application to communicate with farmers in partnership with the government, and used it to push out information around safe hygiene and the importance of hygiene and health aspects during the pandemic. And so it's been, we've found ways to build on our sustainability work to help people in our supply chain in this space. But for us, it's really just hit home that this is so important, all of the things we're working on, and that hasn't changed.
Thanks. It's like a double urgency.
Mm-hmm.
It was already urgent, the water crisis, and now it's doubly urgent. Lucas, what would you like to add to that in terms of how Microsoft is viewing sustainability, your commitments, the timing in light of the pandemic?
Well, I would just reiterate everything that Jill just said and that you just said. I think so many people look at this and they, for some reason, assume that all of the advances on sustainability that the corporate world has been making over the past 12 to 24 months are somehow going to slow or be deprioritized because of COVID. And I can't speak for the rest of the private sector, but for Microsoft, it's only been amplified, the importance of sustainability. In the midst of a pandemic, we've set the most ambitious sustainability goals that our companies ever, consider, and made progress against a bunch of them as well. I think our president, Brad Smith, likes to say that COVID is the crisis of the year and climate is the crisis of the decade. And you don't become a Cargill that's been successful for so many years, or a Microsoft that has been successful for so many years by focusing just on the year, right? You become successful by, executing on the issue of the day and planning for the issues of the future. And so we firmly have our eye on sustainability, and in the context of COVID, of course, but we also see the direct connection between public health and environmental sustainability. And, ultimately, I would just say, the most simplistic way I can summarize, your question about resiliency, your question about accessibility and social license and COVID as well, and climate, is something that our CEO, Satya Nadella, said, which is, at the beginning of COVID, which is, for Microsoft to do well, we need the world to do well. And that's about as simple as it gets. When you're a big company like Microsoft or a Cargill or anything, you're operating at that scale. And we know that if we don't get COVID under control, the world's not going to do well. So we've got to do that. We know that if our climate continues to destabilize, the world's not going to do well, and it's not going to do well for a very long time. So we have to take care of that as well. That's just like baked into our corporate DNA. And water is such a critical kind of, early mover in both COVID and climate that makes this conversation so timely.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and it does just raise the question that I think many of us are asking, which is, what kind of a world do we want to build, and how do we build back better, more equitably, and with urgency? There are a couple questions have come in from our attendees today, so I'd like to offer them to the panel. The first question is, how and when does the WRC envision working with government entities or engaging with the public sector in the watersheds it's targeting? So Jason, you might be able to speak specifically from the WRC point of view. I'm interested, though, in the broader just remit to corporations about how do you work within and with governments to ensure health of the watersheds that you're targeting. Jill, could I ask you to comment on that first?
Yeah, so our water strategy, right? Well, we have quantitative targets around, restoring water in watersheds, removing pollutant from watersheds, and then just helping people with access to safe water. Another pillar of our strategy is that sort of public advocacy and policy work, working with local communities as well. And so we do a lot of work around, for us, specific to our supply chain, working with policymakers around the world on, can they provide incentives to farmers, for example, to, let's say, upgrade irrigation equipment, right, to more state-of-the-art equipment, or, basically incentives or tax breaks, whatever it looks like in various parts of the world. Like, we certainly work on policy as well as an enabler. We know we need governments to also join this fight, right? So the private sector can't do it alone. So we work with our with governments on policy.
And Jay, I know in Jason's opening comments more broadly to the WRC, working, of course, being part of the UN Global Compact, as the WRC is, there is a clear understanding that we need to work in partnership and in alignment with the priorities. Jason, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think it's worth repeating that because water is local, ultimately the ability to have lasting change in any particular region is going to need to connect to the policy frame there and to the public sector stakeholders. Lasting change and impact will require these solutions to be embedded. Now, whether that's about better water governance and multi-stakeholder decision-making that allows for that resiliency planning that Lucas was referring to, or the policies that will allow for the justification to invest in technology solutions, all gets driven from the policy frame. The Water Resilience Coalition itself is not an implementing platform, but instead is looking to partner with different organizations at the local scale. And oftentimes, and at least where we're starting, we can build off of existing structures that are in place. So when I just think of some of the potential partners that are already very much bringing the public sector and private sector together through their activities, we can build off of those existing structures. A good example of that is the World Bank's 2030 Water Resources Group, which is really, in essence, about a collaboration between public and private. And many of the regions that they are working in are places of interest to WRC members. Another example would be the Nature Conservancy and an instrument that they've used called water funds, which is an opportunity to bring private sector entities together around shared goals for water, and then to invest in projects on the ground. What's happened for the more mature water funds is the ability to connect them to the water resource planners and managers, public sector entities. And in some of them, they've now found a way to have water users in the entire region chip into the water funds that are then underwriting the source water protection projects and nature-based solution projects that are being implemented. So that was seed funding from the business community to get this fund off the ground. And now as it goes to scale, linking into public sector mechanisms and dollars that are being spent by the wide range of water users in that basin. But it's the seed funding from the businesses that actually allowed that to go to scale. And I hope that the Water Resilience Coalition can be that innovation incubation mechanism to get things started, and that can be scaled over time with collaboration in the public sector.
Yeah, and it's a relevant point, Jason, to think about the WRC not as an implementing body per se, but then when you think about Jill and Cargill and Lucas and Microsoft and the other 16 founding members of the coalition, they are taking action. And Jill mentioned earlier just the importance of collaboration. And what we see in the Water Resilience Coalition is the complementarity of the expertise, of the ability to scale, of innovation. And I encourage the attendees to read a little bit more about what Cargill and Microsoft are both doing in the areas of innovation. There's incredible work being done, and they are 2 of 16 organizations. So thinking about the power of Truca and Paul as representatives of these organizations on the Water Resilience Leadership Committee, and also the power of the organizations behind them and all 16 organizations in the context of the CEO Water Mandate. So the WRC is absolutely about expanding our ambition and taking bold action. I think I'll offer just a few closing comments, mindful of the time. I first want to thank Jill and Lucas for just sharing really grounded and broad perspective. I'll try to do justice to summarizing a few of the things that I've heard today. So Jason, you opened up, and we've reiterated, I think, through this conversation, just how incredibly urgent this issue is. There's a 56% water gap anticipated by 2050 if we don't take action. 3 billion can't wash their hands in the midst of a pandemic. Both Lucas and Jill talked about it's smart business strategy. It's the right thing to do in terms of stewarding and caring for the communities in which we operate. Lucas, you talked about how, in order for Microsoft to do well, the world has to do well, and you're taking actions to enable that on a very local level. So that is an interesting way to think about the humanity being part of your business strategy and to really take a broad perspective on that. And it also does have the benefit of mitigating reputational risk and ensuring that you have a license to operate. And it's also smart business practice to manage the availability, the quality, and the access. We learned that companies have an outsized opportunity to make an impact. We talked about that 70% in agriculture, 20% industrial. It's estimated that 2/3 of all the fresh water available is used in the provision of the supply chain. And as Jason's slide showed, you may not have seen it, but 150 of the world's largest companies have the potential to influence 1/3 of the total freshwater supply in the world. So there's an outsized impact that companies can have. We didn't get to go too much into collaboration, but I hope that the audience was able to see how even just 2 organizations are coming together to bring their best minds and their best actions to tackle a problem that's way too big to tackle alone. And the call to action is to take action within your environment, to whether you're in a small company or a large corporation, to step up and help accelerate progress against this critical issue. And as we've said a few times, there's this coalition out there that you could explore and join. And that coalition, Jason mentioned those 5 C's, and I won't get all of them right, but the complementarity of skills, the CEO-led ambition and involvement, the bold commitments that are being made, and the collaboration that's happening is unparalleled, I think. So I'll thank the audience. I'll thank the panelists. Thank you, Jason. We'll try to end right at 1 after the hour, and we appreciate your attendance. We appreciate you taking action. Thank you so much.